What if alchemy was never about turning metal into gold, but about something far more sacred? The great work. What if all the ancient symbols, flames, flasks, dragons and stones, were never meant to be taken literally, but were hiding something far more powerful? Your transformation. For centuries, seekers have misunderstood the true nature of the alchemists. They weren't just early chemists or madmen obsessed with riches. They were mystics, visionaries, guardians of an inner process so profound it had to be disguised in metaphor, symbols, and secrecy. Because the real gold was the soul, hidden within dusty grimoires and cryptic symbols lies a secret roadmap, a sacred journey called the Great Work, the Magnum Opus. Not a formula for wealth, but for rebirth. It begins not in a lab, but in your suffering. The ancient alchemists described 7 stages of inner transformation. Calcination, the burning of the false self. Dissolution, the melting down of identity. Separation, the sorting of truth from illusion. Conjunction, the merging of higher and lower aspects. Fermentation, the spark of spiritual life. Distillation, the refinement of purity. And coagulation, the birth of the awakened self. This is not fantasy. It's a hidden process echoed in spiritual texts from Egypt to Tibet. A process every soul must one day walk. So now, ask yourself, what if your greatest heartbreak, your darkest night, was just the fire needed to begin the great work? And what might you become if you surrendered to the transformation? The alchemical process of spiritual transformation begins now. Part 1. The hidden truth of alchemy. Symbols of the soul. Before alchemy was chemistry, it was initiation. Long before modern science reduced it to crude experiments and myths of gold-making, alchemy was the sacred science of the soul. It flourished in ancient Egypt, where the figure known as Hermes Trismegistus became the legendary father of Hermeticism, a fusion of spiritual wisdom and elemental knowledge. It evolved through Islamic mystics and scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, and later shaped the esoteric landscape of Europe through secret societies and coded manuscripts. But here's the truth. The transmutation of lead into gold was never about metal. It was about turning the heavy, dense ego into the radiant, divine self. Lead represented the unrefined self, burdened with fear, shadow, and illusion. Gold symbolized spiritual purity, the soul awakened, whole, and sovereign. Everything in the alchemist's world, the furnace, the flask, the black dragon, the philosopher's stone, was a metaphor, a mirror of the inner world. And no text revealed this more clearly than the Emerald Tablet, a foundational scripture of Hermetic alchemy. Etched into history is its most famous phrase, "As above, so below, as within, so without." A timeless reminder that the cosmos is not separate from you, that the stars above reflect the structure of your soul, that the universe is your teacher and your mirror. The alchemist's laboratory wasn't just a physical space, it was a metaphor for the psyche, the mind, emotions, will, and soul. The fires were not literal flames, but the inner friction of awakening. The ingredients weren't powders and acids, but doubt, pain, insight, and will. To work the great work was to step into a crucible of transformation, a journey through death, purification, and rebirth. Each operation mirrored a stage of inner alchemy. Each symbol held a deeper truth. But the key that unlocks this secret, you are the flask. You are the fire. You are the one being transformed. So what did the alchemists really leave behind? Not formulas, but maps, coded blueprints of inner evolution. And now that you see it, now that you know the gold was always your soul, the real question is, what does the journey actually look like? Because hidden behind the symbols is a step-by-step process, a spiritual technology for transmuting your pain into power. If these symbols were metaphors, then what was the actual process? Let's step into the fire, where the alchemical journey truly begins. Ready for part 2? Calcination, burning away the false self. Part 2, the 7 stages of the great work. Alchemy was never a single spark of transformation. It was a ritual of fire and time, a sequence of 7 sacred stages. Known as the Magnum Opus, or the Great Work, these were the inner operations every soul had to pass through to turn illusion into truth and suffering into light. Let's step into the fire, stage by stage. Calcination, the burning of the false self. This is where the ego begins to crack, where pride, identity, and illusions about who you think you are get scorched in the fire of crisis. Life humbles you. A loss, a breakdown, a betrayal. It's the soul's matchstick, igniting the flames that burn away everything that is not real. This is ego death, and it hurts. This is the soul's rite of passage, where suffering isn't punishment, but preparation. The fire doesn't destroy you. It reveals who you were always meant to become. Dissolution, the melting of identity. Now you dissolve. Tears flow, emotions rise. You become unmoored. Old beliefs liquefy, certainty vanishes. It feels like drowning, but you're being softened, made permeable, ready to receive truth. This is the surrender. The moment when you stop fighting and finally let go. Separation, distilling the true from the false. Now the waters settle, and in the clarity you begin to separate. This is where you start to discern which parts of you were masks, which wounds are stories, and which are teachers. You extract the essence of your soul from the debris of the past. Conjunction, union of shadow and light. Now you reunite the opposites, your shadow and your higher self. You don't banish your darkness, you integrate it. You realize the wound was always the gateway. That healing doesn't mean perfection. It means wholeness, fermentation, the spiritual spark. This is the death before rebirth. You've done the work. And now, nothing happens. You sit in the void, the dark night of the soul. But something deep within begins to stir. A whisper, a dream, a flash of knowing. This is the moment the soul breathes again. Distillation, purifying consciousness. Now you rise above. You observe the mind instead of being lost in it. You refine your thoughts, align your energy. Meditation deepens, insights sharpen. You're no longer reacting, you're responding from presence. The fog is gone, the self becomes clear light. Coagulation, the birth of the Philosopher's Stone. This is the final crystallization. You become the stone, no longer seeking, you've become the truth. You walk in alignment. Your presence heals. You don't just carry the light. You are it. These are not abstract steps. They mirror the real initiations of life. The breakdowns, the awakenings, the moments where everything changed. And if you've been through pain, you've already walked parts of this path. But here's the thing. No alchemist walked alone. Behind every initiate was a guide. Not always a person, but a presence. So who guided the ancient alchemists through the fire? Let's uncover the spiritual allies of transformation. Ready for part 3? The role of the inner guide and sacred symbols. Part 3. The role of the inner guide and sacred fire. Every true transformation has a guide, not always a teacher in robes or a master in the flesh, but something far more intimate. The inner alchemist. The part of you that remembers who you are, even when you forget. Call it the higher self, the divine spark, the sacred witness behind the story of your life. This inner guide doesn't speak in words. It moves in symbols, silence, and synchronicity. In every alchemical tradition, there is mention of the sacred fire, a mysterious force that transforms base matter into gold. But in the esoteric view, that fire lives within you. It's not literal flame, it's the energetic power that turns pain into wisdom, grief into grace, and ego into essence. In Hindu yogic systems, this force is called Kundalini, a coiled energy at the base of the spine, waiting to rise. In Taoist alchemy, it's Qi, life force energy that flows through the meridians. In Kabbalah, it's the Shekinah, the divine presence moving through the tree of life. And in early Christian mysticism, it was called the Holy Fire, a purifying presence that descended upon the soul, but none of it activates without one essential ingredient: intention. You must choose to walk the path. You must invite the fire, because this transformation isn't imposed, it's initiated from within, and once it begins, ritual becomes your compass, stillness becomes your sanctuary, and devotion, not to a deity, but to the truth within, becomes your power source. The alchemists didn't just mix metals, they meditated, they fasted, they practiced ritual silence, because they knew the deeper the stillness, the clearer the guidance. And they wrote in code, because the true journey is one that can only be walked in consciousness, not intellect. That's why the ancient texts speak in riddles, why their formulas were cloaked in metaphors, why only the initiated could decipher the meaning behind the symbols. Because what they were guarding was not chemical recipes, but a sacred inner technology. And when you begin to listen to that inner alchemist, when you trust the sacred fire rising through your own being, you realize you were never transforming lead into gold. You were transforming self into soul. And yet for centuries, this path was hidden, guarded, suppressed. Why? Because a soul who knows how to transmute pain into power, who doesn't fear the fire, who follows no one but the truth within, cannot be controlled. So who feared this process so deeply that they buried it beneath religion, fear, and flames? Let's unveil the story they never wanted you to remember. Up next, Part 4, Why Spiritual Alchemy Was Forbidden. Part 4, Why Inner Alchemy Was Hidden from the World. If spiritual alchemy is the process of becoming divine, then ask yourself, why was it buried so deeply? Why were the alchemists silenced, ridiculed, or killed? Because once a person learns to transmute pain into power, to burn away illusion and awaken truth, they become sovereign, and sovereignty is the greatest threat to control. The great institutions of history, churches, monarchs, empires, were not built on spiritual freedom. They were built on hierarchy, obedience, dependency. If the masses realized they didn't need an intermediary, didn't need to confess to a priest, or beg for grace from a throne, they would stop following, they would start awakening. So, alchemy had to be twisted, recast, turned from sacred science into heresy. The word alchemist became synonymous with madmen, or worse, sorcerers. Their sacred tools were labeled demonic, their language occult, their experiments blasphemous. Why? Because inner transformation is the end of outer control. The alchemist doesn't ask for permission, they seek only truth within themselves. And so, the true teachings of the great work went underground. They were hidden in symbols, encoded in myths, and passed through mystery schools that survived in shadows. Rosicrucians, Gnostics, Sufis, yogis, Taoist monks. Each held a piece of the code, each protected it, knowing that only the worthy would see through the veil. The texts became riddles. The recipes became allegories. Because to the unawakened, alchemy would always seem like fantasy. But for the initiate, for the one ready to burn, dissolve, and rise again, these texts were maps, maps through the fire, maps through the dark night of the soul, maps back to the self, reborn, refined, radiant. Those who practiced this path in the past paid dearly. Mystics like Giordano Bruno were burned alive, not for summoning demons, but for daring to say divinity lives within. And like him, many alchemists were exiled, silenced, or killed, branded with the same word used to condemn all real seekers: dangerous. But the real danger was never the practice. It was what the practice unlocked. A human being who knows how to transmute fear, who doesn't need approval, who walks with the divine within, cannot be ruled. And so, the sacred fire was hidden, not extinguished. Just waiting, waiting for a time when souls would rise again, when the ancient texts would be understood not by scholars, but by the hearts of the ready. And that time is now. Because the great work was never lost. It was simply waiting for you. So, how do you begin? Next, Part 5, Awakening as the Philosopher's Stone. Part 5, Becoming the Philosopher's Stone. The fire was never your enemy. It was always the invitation. Because the final stage of the great work is not about escaping the world. It's about becoming something new within it. This is coagulation, the alchemical union of all opposites, when the fragmented self becomes whole, when the soul becomes the stone. Not a rock, not a relic, but a state of being, immovable in truth, radiant in clarity, sovereign in spirit. All that was burned in calcination, all that was dissolved, separated, purified, now fuses together, not in confusion, but in consciousness. You are no longer at war with your shadow, no longer ruled by the ego, no longer asleep within the illusion of control. You are awake, integrated, aligned. This is why the alchemists never sought to flee the world. They sought to transform within it, to walk the same streets, face the same chaos, but from a different frequency. To live as the philosopher's stone is to move through life as a conscious being of transmutation. You don't resist pain, you refine it. You don't avoid fear, you alchemize it. You don't worship light or shadow, you become the space that contains both. So how do you begin this final phase? You don't need a lab. You need rituals of presence, shadow journaling, face your inner distortions, breathwork, ignite the inner fire, and purge resistance. Elemental invocation. Call upon earth, water, air, fire within you. Silence, because in silence, the gold rises. This isn't performance, it's process. Alchemy was never about magic tricks. It was about becoming the magic. The stone was never an object to find. It was the self remembered, the soul purified and fearless, able to hold both joy and sorrow, without breaking. And when you reach this state, you don't need to prove anything. You simply shine. You live as a living sigil of truth, a vibrational key to awaken others, a soul no longer waiting to be saved, but radiating salvation from within. This is the sacred irony. The world told you to fear the fire, but the fire was your path to light. A lone seeker steps into the flame, not to be consumed, but to be transformed. And when they emerge, not an object, not a goal, but a frequency, embodied, unshakable, eternal. Final question. If the fire comes for you, will you burn or will you transmute? Now, the great work is yours. The only question left is, will you begin it? Final CTA. If you are the alchemist, then your pain is the raw material. Subscribe and begin the great work, not in theory, but in your very cells. Next episode teaser: why the Vatican keeps an exorcism department. For centuries, the Church has denied, dismissed, and demonized. But behind closed doors, it quietly maintains one of the most secretive spiritual operations on Earth. In the next episode, we'll uncover what the Vatican really knows about possession and what they're not telling you.